I'm going to be talking to Professor Severin Borenstein, who's Faculty Director, Energy Institute at Haas, University of California, Berkeley, and a co-author of a recent blog post titled, "Is Taxing Carbon Really the Best Way to Decarbonize the Grid?" Welcome to the interview, Severin.
Thanks. Nice to be with you.
Now, I've had, I don't know how many economists on talking about carbon pricing and decarbonizing some sector of the economy, oil and gas, the power grid, whatever it happens to be. And economists love carbon pricing. But I also interviewed Danny Cullenward from Stanford, and he had written a book where he made your argument, where it's not sufficient unto itself to do the job. What's your argument in your blog post?
Well, I think there's actually a difference between some of the political arguments against carbon pricing, some of the distributional arguments, and the direct economic efficiency issue. And the point we're making in our blog post and in our recent research paper is around economic efficiency. It has long been taken that, well, carbon pricing may have some drawbacks in terms of politics and some of the distributional concerns. At least it's the most efficient way to decarbonize the grid in terms of the straight economics. And that's important, of course, because what economists call economic efficiency, the rest of the world calls making the pie bigger. So if we want to still have resources to go around and to improve people's lives, we want to minimize the inefficiency in the economy. The point we're making in our paper and in our blog is that carbon pricing, the point we're making in our paper and in our blog is that some of the advantages people have talked about when it comes to carbon pricing over alternative policies aren't as big as are commonly thought to be in the electricity sector. And there's some significant disadvantages in the electricity sector. And I do have to point out, this is really focused on electricity. In fact, in the blog post, we make the point that this doesn't apply to gasoline and transportation.
What are some of the disadvantages of a carbon price, relying too much on carbon pricing in the power sector, Severin?
Well, there's the first issue is that people often think carbon pricing is going to really much more efficiently decarbonize the grid than things like a clean electricity standard or just subsidizing clean energy, because it drives out the dirtiest forms of generation, particularly coal-fired generation, first. What our analysis showed is that's true, but it turns out that with relatively low gas prices, which I think we're going to have in the not too distant future again, that's going to happen under a clean electricity standard as well, or subsidizing clean energy. The big disadvantage is that in most of the places where they're really decarbonizing the grid, they have a problem with retail prices, and that is that retail prices are too high. In fact, they're discouraging electrification. And the reason for that is getting to a decarbonized grid costs real money. And it causes us to to increase retail prices to a point that they're not really reflecting the cost of using more electricity. They're reflecting the cost of a lot of infrastructure and programs that go along with it. The problem with that is, if we want people to electrify everything in order to get to a low carbon future, we can't charge them astronomical prices for electricity because it makes an electric vehicle less cost effective, heat pumps for heating and for hot water heating, and so forth. And that's the path that a lot of parts of the world, and particularly parts of the United States, are now on.
So just to use an example from my own life, we just a couple months ago put in a heat pump in our bungalow, and in here in British Columbia, we pay 9.6 cents a kilowatt hour. It's a very low price. But if I had to pay 20, and our electric bill with the heat pump, even with the AC going in the summer, is ridiculously low. I think we're going to pay $70 a month. If I had to pay 24 cents or 30 cents a kilowatt hour, I might think twice about shelling out the upfront capital to install that heat pump. Is that your argument, basically?
Yeah, and actually here in California, where I live in Northern California, my rate during the summer now, it varies between 44 and 49 cents a kilowatt hour. And even in the winter, it's only about 10 cents less per kilowatt hour. So when you start looking at the economics of heat pumps or even electric vehicles, it really takes a bite out of it, because when you look at the actual cost of providing that electricity, it's almost certainly 20 cents a kilowatt hour less than that or more. And so we are massively overpricing electricity. If you put in a carbon tax, what that does is it raises the cost of the wholesale electricity. Economists generally like that. They say we should be facing those externality costs in what we pay for an energy source. But the problem is we're already overpricing electricity, so it's pushing it further away from the right level. In contrast with gasoline and with natural gas, residential use of natural gas, with gasoline, we're almost certainly underpricing it compared to its full cost to society. And with natural gas, a study I did last year showed that we're probably pricing it about right compared to its full social cost. But electricity is massively overpriced. So if we want people switching from gasoline and natural gas to electricity for transportation, for heating, for hot water heating, we got to get that back in line. We can't keep pushing electricity prices higher and higher.
Now, before we get into a question of what policies then should replace or augment carbon pricing, I want to ask you a question, and we didn't talk about this beforehand, so you can guide me as to whether you feel comfortable answering it. But the last time I checked, you still sat on the board of CAISO, the California Independent System Operator. What's CAISO's take on this about overpricing electricity? Because it has some influence on that.
Well, CAISO doesn't really have a policy on overpricing retail electricity. That's not the business they're in. They're in the wholesale market. The big adder that's pushing our electricity prices up relative to the true cost isn't at the wholesale market. It's things that are getting added on top. It's the cost of distribution systems. It's a whole bunch of programs California adds in, including subsidies for renewables, for rooftop solar, subsidies to help out low-income customers, subsidies for energy efficiency. All of those things are being paid for through higher electricity prices.
Well, let's talk about what should be done. What kind of policies are you recommending?
Well, I think that the taxing carbon is still on the table and should be for most sectors outside of electricity. But when it comes to electricity, I think we have to recognize this problem with overpricing retail electricity. And that means policies that don't necessarily push up prices, one of which is a clean electricity standard, one that says X% of generation in a system or for a load serving entity has to come from zero carbon sources. That in many ways operates like a carbon tax, except it doesn't push up the overall cost of electricity as much, or just subsidizing clean electricity. That also we show it doesn't do much worse in phasing out the dirtiest sources first, but it helps keep electricity prices down. Now, in the end, we have to find other ways to do this as well, including taking a lot of those programs I mentioned off of electricity prices, maybe putting them on the state budget, maybe paying for them through monthly fixed charges so that they don't affect the cost of consuming additional electricity. But right now, and I think for most systems, as they decarbonize and you take those externalities out of the cost of providing electricity, if you're making it the social cost actually lower, well, you're making the retail price higher, you're going to make this gap bigger and bigger, and you're going to really discourage efficient electrification.
Final question, Severin. We've talked a lot about California. What about other jurisdictions like Texas, the Northeast Coast, Midwest? Same principle applies?
Yeah, the same basic principle applies. California is a real outlier that we've put so many different programs and now wildfire mitigation and control into our electricity prices. But the same basic problem applies, because as you clean up your system, you're going to have more and more capital costs that have to be covered somehow that really aren't the cost, part of the cost when I flip on my light or plug in my electric vehicle. We have to pay for those, but if we pay for those through high volumetric electricity prices, we're going to discourage electrification. And that's going to be true in any system, because electricity, particularly the transmission and distribution systems, have a lot of capital costs that just are not part of the incremental cost of providing electricity.
Severin, thank you very much for your insights, and thank you for doing this.
Great to be with you.